This is a video about the brand new Boldy James album called Across the Tracks, which is entirely produced by producer Conductor Williams. Boldy James is an artist, a rapper, who I've had eyes on for a while, and has been extremely successful and prolific since about 2019 or 2020, when he began releasing a run of albums that has continued to this day, which is considered by many to be a classic run of albums already, only in the past 4 years. And he's collaborated with a plethora of artists like Westside Gunn and Billy Woods, and has been come to known as a very talented and successful rapper in the past 4 years. And if you listen to his best verses and his guest verses on a lot of songs, he seems extremely consistent and able to rap over just about any beat. What hasn't been consistent, however, is the quality of his solo projects, those only being credited to him and works with other producers entirely curating the entire album. He's had some incredibly high highs over this 4 to 5 year run, including albums like Manger on McNichols, which showcased his incredible storytelling abilities and virtuoso-ness to rap over any type of rap beat that was thrown at him, or an album like Bo Jackson, releasing in 2021, entirely produced by legendary producer The Alchemist, showcasing his braggadocious flows over really nice-sounding beats for a whole full project. But in that same vein and in that same time period, he's stooped down to a lot of subpar or even very bad projects. Ones released more recently, like Indiana Jones, being a bloated mess that had no direction and seemed very boring with an AI-generated cover, almost as if he didn't even care about the output of his work. After suffering a near-fatal car accident in the last year, 2023, he released an album at the start of this year named Penalty of Leadership that I actually really loved and showed a lot of promise for Boldy, which might actually be my album of the year currently. And its strengths were suited in Boldy's rapping over these cold-sounding beats while having his monotone flow that keeps things interesting with his wordplay. Sadly for this album, though, he didn't bring anything really new or even interesting to the table, and neither did the producer, Conductor Williams, who produced every song on this album. For the beats on this album, the conductor brought a lot of jazz and soul samples, like on the intro for the album, Terms and Conditions, which does sound nice at first, but upon further inspection, in my opinion, sounds very hollow, and Boldy sounds more uninterested than ever during his modern run. The drums just don't sound like they're all the way there, Boldy, of course, sounding more sleepy than ever. And these types of beats are nothing new for Boldy. The quality may be a little bit lower than his usual standards, but they're about par for the course in terms of the style. But he himself doesn't really step up to the plate and try and steal a show in any of these areas, on any of the songs really. He does just kind of ride the wave of mediocrity for a lot of the album. What sucks the most, since I'm not really surprised by Boldy's mediocrity here, is that the conductor didn't step up to the plate for these beats on the album. He's produced for artists like Boldy James, Westside Gunn, and the aforementioned Drake, and as far as I've heard, he's produced nothing but bangers. The only beat I haven't really liked from him was Stories About My Brother by Drake, which was more dragged down by his performance than anything else. So it does sadden me quite a bit that for this album, it sounds like there was nothing really brought to the table in terms of interestingness or even really sounding that good. On this album specifically, Boldy James seemed the most concerned with hooks and choruses than he ever has before in the last 4 to 5 years, on songs like Flying Trapeze Act. It's another very boring and uninteresting song, which features Boldy monotonely rapping about his usual drug dealing and American gang stories, which are, what you expect from him, but it just kind of falls flat when he doesn't do anything new or interesting with this after doing it for 13 years. Or a song like All Madden, where Boldy attempts to make some sort of catchy chorus, but ultimately ends up falling flat. The song also features a verse from someone who's only known as Bo Jack on streaming, and who I only can assume is a child by the sound of their voice, and the name, that's shown on streaming at least, makes me believe it would be Boldy James' son, as I know he does have at least one kid. And the funny thing is, this child brings more energy to the song than Boldy James, which I think is really funny, because it just shows Boldy James' kind of reluctance to try too hard. As much as I can criticize the production here, it does get kind of interesting in some places, like on the song The Old Switcheroo, which has another jazz song sample for the melody, which is nothing new for either the conductor or Boldy James. But what captivated me here was the actual drum samples that were used, specifically the snare, which doesn't sound like anything you normally would hear. It sounds like something out of a JPEG Mafia or Death Grip song. At first, I was a bit weirded out and confused by the choice, but after hearing the song for a couple days and trying to listen to it more and more, I think it actually works very well, and it does spice up the song a bit. It doesn't save it all the way, but I think it is nice that he added that little bit of production that is just very unique. However, Boldy himself doesn't try to do anything experimental or even very interesting on this song. The thing of most notoriety in this song is that around the 2-minute mark, he tried to really amp up his voice and put a lot of energy into it, and it just ended up sounding really forced and felt really flat, which just proves to me that there was probably no saving this album, because one of my criticisms is that he sounded very bored and monotone, but as shown in this song, even when he tries to make his voice sound more punctuated and more vigorous, it just sounds forced, and it just makes me feel like this album just should have been left on the shelf. This song in particular does have some of the more interesting lines on the album, at least, because Boldy is known for his punchlines that he just kind of leaves in the air and doesn't really accentuate too much. He says, "How's she all about me like do-re," which I thought was kind of funny, obviously referencing the do-re-mi scale. And he says, "The only reason I rap is because I can't sing," which I think is kind of interesting and could be taken as a sort of commentary towards how artists that make pop music and sing are way more prolific, but Boldy's not a good singer, so he had to turn to rapping. Overall, this album seemed to have no trajectory or even general idea that they wanted to convey or put through with this album, which isn't always a bad thing. You listen to an album like No Idols, there's not a real direction there aside from just being fuck everybody else. But that album ended up being a good experience. It just sounds like a very flowy afternoon. This album, however, just sounds very discombobulated and very quickly put together in a rush. And it ends up bringing out Boldy James's most formulaic and attracting traits through this album. Like I mentioned before, albums like Manger on McNichols or Penalty of Leadership, obviously, have a clear through line, or at least path, that is trying to be carved through the album. This one just kind of leaves everything up in the air and doesn't really give you anything to stick with. I just believe the cracks in Boldy James' formula are starting to show. This album is a 6 out of 10, in my opinion.